You're listening to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast, episode number 87. Welcome to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. I'm your host, Paula Price, lawyer turned certified executive coach. This podcast was created to empower women lawyers just like you to create a life and practice you love. Join me every week for a break from the hustle so we can focus on you, what you truly want, and how you can create it. If you're over the overwhelm, done with putting out fires, and ready to redefine success on your own terms, you're in the right place. Ready for today's episode? Let's dive in. Hello, my friend. Welcome back to the podcast. It's Paula here, and I'm so glad to have you here with me this week. Welcome. If you are listening to this podcast when it goes live, we are mid-January 2023, and I hope that your year is off to a beautiful start. I can share with you that 2023 has been amazing so far. It has been a whirlwind. It's just been a couple of weeks, but it's wonderful. I had the absolute privilege of meeting with the women lawyers who are in my group coaching and mastermind experience for the next 6 months. We had our first call earlier today, and seeing their gorgeous faces on my Zoom screen and talking about what we're going to do together over the next 6 months was incredible. And as I was preparing for that call, as we were talking, I was thinking about where we are now and where we're going to be 6 months from now. And I'm so very excited to be able to walk alongside them during this process and to see what we create over this period of time. So for each of you, whether you're listening to this podcast episode when it goes live or some other time, I would invite you to think about where you are today and where you want to be 6 months from now. And think big, think of big possibilities, because that process of setting goals and working hard to achieve them is such a wonderful learning and growing experience. And if I can ever support you in something like that, please do feel free to reach out. I would love to do that with you. Now, today's episode is the second episode in a 4-part series that I'm putting on that talks about the relationship between executive functioning skills and time management. And I'm talking about it in relation specifically to you and your legal practice. Now, if you joined me last week, then you'll know that what we talked about was one of the stages. And so what I've done here is I've divided the series into 4 parts, and each part reflects a stage. So last week we talked about what you do before you get started on a task in order to save time. This week we are talking about task initiation. So basically overcoming procrastination. Next week, I'll be talking about staying focused, dealing with distractions. And then in the 4th week, I'll be talking about finishing what you start. So that really is task completion. Now, if you joined last week, then you'll know that I talked about executive functioning skills, what they are and why they matter. And so if you haven't listened to that episode, I highly encourage you to go back and listen to it. I think you'll find it really helpful, both from a time management, saving time perspective, and also to help set you up for today's episode. You will also have heard me say that I really have 2 objectives when it comes to this series. The first objective is that what I'm hoping to do is to raise your awareness of what your executive functioning skills are. So we go through those skills one at a time in relation to each of the topics, because I believe that when you understand what your executive functioning skills are and how they relate to the time that you manage in your practice, the work products you create, your efficiency, your results, etc. Once you have an understanding of that relationship, you are better placed to be more strategic in terms of how you exercise those skills to save time. The other reason that I'm doing this series of podcast episodes is that if you find that you are lacking in any of these areas, you can actually strengthen and grow your executive functioning skills. And so what I'm trying to do here is to give you some ideas and some strategies to help you get stronger in areas where you may want to develop more strengths. What you can also do, and I talk about this in the earlier episode as well as this episode, is pairing. So if you find you're really strong in one area when it comes to executive functioning, then you may pair that with an area that you're not quite as strong. So that's just something to think about. So today we are going to be talking about procrastination. What to do when you sit down to do a task and you just don't want to do it. You might feel like there's inertia. You might struggle when it comes to doing tasks that you dread. And if this is something that you relate to, I just want to let you know that you are not alone. All humans procrastinate. I believe it's probably hardwired somewhere in our DNA. When it comes to a task that we simply do not want to do, there can be a tendency to put it off. And some of you will procrastinate more than others. And wherever you find yourself on the spectrum, I think you'll find today's podcast episode helpful because it will help you identify the executive functioning skills that are at play and how they might show up for you. Now, procrastination, if we want to define it, can be described as the act of delaying something that must be done, often because it's unpleasant or boring. And I took this definition from the Cambridge Online Dictionary, and I liked this definition for this particular episode because it incorporates that notion of should, right? That idea that something must be done. And it also incorporates the notion that the task itself is being put off because it's unpleasant or boring. There's a reason that we don't want to do it. And if you think about yourself in relationship to your practice, chances are, if you find that you procrastinate, then you might find that that happens in relation to a certain type of task. You might notice patterns. And so as we go through the episode, think about where you procrastinate, what those patterns are, how you feel when you're procrastinating, the strategies that you're using to deal with procrastination. And we're going to revisit all of that. And my goal for you is that when you walk away from this episode, you are going to feel empowered, that you have tools and strategies that you can use next time you catch yourself about to procrastinate. Now, another thing I want to touch on before we dive in is that procrastination really is an exercise or lack of exercise of your executive functioning skills. It is not a moral failing. I think a lot of people who procrastinate feel badly about themselves. They beat themselves up. They carry around a lot of shame around it. And I just want you to be able to dissociate the act of procrastination from who you are as a human being, and do not carry it as a burden or a judgment on yourself that you're somehow less than. So really take that to heart. If you need to hear it from somebody, you're hearing it from me. There's no shame in it. It is not a moral failing. You are human. You've got a human brain, and I am going to help you figure out what to do next time you catch yourself putting something off. So procrastination will look different depending on who you are and how it shows up in your practice. Some people practice with their hair on fire. If that is you, you know what that means. You're probably jumping from task to task. Your practice feels very reactive. Maybe it feels disorganized. You really are at the mercy or at the affect or of your practice. One lawyer described it as, I don't run my practice. It's the other way around. My practice runs me. That may be because you are not doing things ahead of time. It may be that you are procrastinating. And so that might be something that you can relate to. You may find that you're the type of person that needs stress in order to get motivated. So you might have a long to-do list, but you have absolutely no motivation to do it unless there's some pressure associated with it. That may mean that you're pushing things off and leaving them until the last minute because that's what it takes to light that fire under your belly so that you can initiate the task. It may be that you have a lot of difficult emotions that you feel in relation to your practice. So you might feel a lot of stress. You might feel shame that you are aware of this problem and yet you aren't able to effectively deal with it. You might feel a general level of anxiety in your practice because you know that you've got these looming deadlines and yet you seem stuck. You're unable to take action. You may live in fear because you wonder where your procrastination is going to trip you up, where you're going to come into a real problem. You might also feel like your practice is just sweaty. And that's a word that I sometimes use to describe those situations where, you get the job done, but it's not pretty and it's more stressful than it needs to be. It just feels a little bit sweaty. Now, you might find that the reason that you procrastinate is because it's a carryover of strategies that used to work for you at an earlier stage of your professional career or your academic life. And so when I think back to Paula Price as a high school student, things were very different back then. And if I had a test, for example, what I would use as a strategy is just to take really good notes when I was in class, not pay super close attention. And then in the day or two before the exam, I'd take those notes, I would learn everything I needed to learn, and then I would write the exam. And that strategy worked for me. I was able to get the grades that I wanted using that procrastinating approach. When I hit university, that strategy was no longer effective because yes, I could take the really detailed notes, but the exams covered a lot more material and I didn't have as much time in the end to prepare the way that I needed to prepare. So I had to change my strategy. Now, you might find the same thing working in a law firm or environment or other professional environment where strategies that were effective when you first started out are no longer effective. So when you think about being an articling student or a junior lawyer, it may be that you can put things off, that you've got the space in your calendar to do things last minute, that the way that work flows to you, maybe you have some control over that, you're able to negotiate deadlines. There may be a number of reasons why you're able to procrastinate. But as your practice evolves, you may find that you're not able to procrastinate. So what might happen is your schedule becomes really, really busy and you find yourself fielding last minute assignments. So if you leave a project to the last minute, you may find that you don't have the luxury of a pocket of time where you can actually work on it because some other project has come in that you weren't aware was going to land on your desk and now you're stuck in a time crunch. You might also find as your practice evolves that you're involving more people in the work product. And so you may have an assistant that you're relying on. You may have other lawyers that you're relying on. You may have outside contractors that you're relying on. You may be asking your client for information that you need to move forward on a file. And so what you might find is that if you're pushing off your tasks, you may not see until a late stage in your project that you actually need somebody else to help you. And what that might mean is that you're then sending emails or making phone calls or requesting of other people that they do things on a very tight turnaround, and that can make them uncomfortable. You may have experienced this yourself if somebody has done that to you. And what you also might find is that it's really disruptive to relationships that you have with senior lawyers or clients that you report to. If you are procrastinating and you are giving them work product at the very last minute, if there's anything with that work product that requires revision or needs work before it can go and be filed in court or sent off to the client, then now you're creating an additional layer of problem really for the person who is in effect your client. And so the tools that got you here very likely aren't the tools that are going to get you there. Now, because I'm a professional coach, I hear and I see this problem from both angles. So the angle from management in a law firm or other organization, and from the angle of the lawyer who is struggling with procrastination. From the management perspective, it is really challenging because they may be really trying to support a particular lawyer who is struggling with procrastination, but they don't necessarily know exactly what the problem is or what they can do to help. So I sometimes hear from lawyers who are, or professional development individuals who reach out to me to help support lawyers with their practice management. And if it's done at an early enough stage, then there's an opportunity to work on the time management skills. There's an opportunity to turn things around. But if it's left too long, then what I've seen happen is that the lawyer kind of erodes their relationship with their colleagues, and it may reach a point where it's no longer salvageable. And so from the management perspective, that is a story that I sometimes hear in relation to lawyers. And I'm always so disappointed because I think there's an opportunity for that lawyer to learn and develop these skills. And really, these are the practical skills that are required to enable that lawyer to do the substantive work that we know that they can do. And so if you are in management and you're listening to this, then please know that I'm a resource and there are other coaches who are resources out there who can help lawyers who are really struggling with time management. Now, if you are the lawyer, because I also hear from the lawyers who struggle with time management, they aren't doing this on purpose. Again, this goes back to that moral failing. This is not a moral flaw. This is not laziness. This is nothing like that. It is simply that they may not have full understanding of their executive functioning and how they can strengthen these skills and manage their practice better and to overcome procrastination. So if this is you, I just want you to know that yes, there are tools that can help you. And that is what we're talking about today, specifically in relation to procrastination. And if this is a topic that resonates with you, you will want to listen to the last episode if you haven't already. And please do stay tuned for the upcoming 2 episodes because we're talking about a number of executive functions in relation to various stages of projects. And these will help you save time and also have a better organized practice and experience less stress in your practice. So procrastination, as I've mentioned, is really tied to your executive functioning skills. And today we're going to be talking about 2 of them. The first is task initiation. The second is emotional regulation. Another executive functioning skill that may be relevant, but I'm not going to talk about it today, is impulse control. And we're going to be talking about that next week when we talk about staying on task or dealing with distractions. So stay tuned for that. Now, if you procrastinate, you may already have a number of strategies that you're using to deal with that. One strategy might be that you're not doing anything at all. You might realize that you procrastinate and you may set yourself up with the goal of not procrastinating anymore. You get a new project, a new assignment, a new file, and you tell yourself this time is going to be different. I'm going to get on top of it. I'm going to get my deadlines all sorted out. I'm going to submit my work product in advance. I'm going to file my materials in advance. And you sit down to do the work and you feel unmotivated. And maybe you turn to your email or other forms of more instant gratification. Then you declare yourself having failed in the attempt and you give up. Or maybe what you use as a strategy is you decide to bully yourself with fear. So what that might look like is that yes, you get the job done, but along the way, you're really putting pressure on yourself to do it. And by the end of it, you feel exhausted, you hate your work, and you have a very rocky relationship with yourself. Now, an analogy that comes to mind has nothing to do with practicing law and very little to do with procrastination, but it has to do with a strategy that my mother used with me when it came to laundry. And I love my mother. God bless her. She's a wonderful human being, and I really do love her and appreciate her. When I was younger and I would do my own laundry, I had to put things in the dryer. And if you have ever used a dryer, then chances are you've dealt with that lint catcher, the lint filter, and you need to take that filter and remove the lint on a regular basis in order for your dryer to work properly. Now, my mother used to tell me, Paula, if you do not remove the lint from the lint filter and you turn that dryer on, the dryer is going to catch fire. And when the dryer catches fire, the whole house is going to burn down. And so she instilled in me the fear of God that if I pressed that start button without dealing with the lint first, terrible consequences were going to follow from that. And if you've ever changed the lint filter or you've cleared the lint filter, then you know that the contents of a filter are like nothing. It's like this soft, fluffy lint. It's utterly harmless. And yet, to me, that lint filter exercise was an exercise that was motivated by fear and dread. So, if you find yourself using fear and dread as motivators in your practice, if that's what it takes for you to get the job done, you may find that you are not using your cortisol in a most effective way, right? You might be really fatiguing yourself, stressing yourself out when it's not actually necessary. Another strategy you might use is to push things off until they get urgent. So if you find that you need that pressure to make things work, that might be what you do and the motivation kicks in. The downside, of course, being that if you needed extra time or if other people involved in the project needed extra time, you no longer have that luxury. You no longer have that window. And finally, another strategy you might use is to neglect a task until it's taken away from you. Now, that's one thing. If you live with roommates and you don't do the dishes and eventually they get tired of you and they do the dishes themselves, well, they may resent you a little bit, but it's not the end of the world necessarily. It depends on your roommate, depends on how many dishes you're leaving. But in a legal practice, if you find that your work is being taken away from you because you're simply not doing it, that cannot feel good. And it deprives you of the opportunity to do the work. It deprives you of the opportunity to build a relationship with the person who you're working with. And it deprives you of the opportunity to build the skills that you would build in doing that particular work. So these strategies, I don't think, are particularly effective when it comes to managing procrastination. They don't work because you're not addressing the real problem, which, of course, is learning how to leverage your executive functioning skills of task initiation and emotional regulation. And if you don't learn how to manage your procrastination, the task itself doesn't get easier. So I invite you to think about how you can apply the strategies that we talk about today as soon as you can within your practice, because the sooner you get started, the sooner you're going to start to see results and the more you're going to be able to build these skills. So what happens if you don't engage in strategies that are effective is that you may find that you repeat patterns and habits that reinforce a cycle of procrastination. You continue to push things off. You continue to use this fear-based motivation. You continue to practice with your hair on fire. You continue to leave things to the last minute. And what that produces is, number one, a very stressful work experience for you and potentially the other colleagues or clients that work with you. You may find that you produce inconsistent results that are somehow inexplicable for those around you. They don't understand why sometimes the work product that you deliver is first rate and other times it just isn't. And so that can create a breakdown of relationships. It can create a breakdown of trust. You may find that others have difficulty trusting you. You may find that you have difficulty trusting yourself. You may start to identify yourself as a procrastinator. I've talked about labels before in the podcast. So when you start to see yourself a certain way and then you live into that reputation that you've given to yourself, and ultimately you don't make any progress, you don't get better at dealing with procrastination. And so you just come to accept it as being part of who you are, part of your practice, and you just decide that you're going to resign yourself to living with those results. So today, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about 3 strategies that you can use to overcome procrastination in your practice. And what you'll find is that we're talking about those strategies in a relatively strategic way, a more surgical, precision approach. I think that when you can look at procrastination and break it down into smaller components, it's a lot easier to tackle. And that's exactly what we're doing here. So we're looking at your executive function. I'm going to talk about each of them. And first, I'm actually going to offer a sort of setup strategy that ties back to last week's podcast episode. So there are 3 strategies. The first of them is scaffolding. The second is task initiation. And the third is emotional regulation. So scaffolding really goes back to what we talked about last week. And by scaffolding, what I mean is procrastination does not happen in a vacuum. If you find that you're procrastinating before you engage in the tasks that deal specifically with the executive functioning skills, I want you to take a step back and see yourself in context. Before anything, are you physically fit to do the task that you want to do? That means, are you rested? Have you eaten? Have you given yourself enough breaks in the day? Because sometimes the reason you can't initiate on a task is because you're exhausted or hungry. You're not physically in the right state to be doing that work. So that starts before anything. The other thing that I would like you to think about in terms of scaffolding and setting yourself up for success is to look at the structure of your practice. Look at how you have structured your weeks, how you have scheduled your days. What does your office space look like? Is it all conducive to you doing your tasks in a timely way, initiating them as you wish to initiate them? Now, for anybody who has ever raised a toddler, you know that those little tiny humans thrive when they are in a structured environment, and they go crazy if they don't have the right structures in place. They become dysregulated, they throw tantrums, they cry, they don't know what's going on. And large adult humans are, I would say, the same. I know for myself, I function so much more smoothly when I have structures in play. And I invite you to think about the role that structure plays in your practice. Now, you might think about times in your life where you have made transitions and how a shift in structure or a lack of structure has impacted you. For lawyers, we often see a bumpy transition, I'll say, from law school to law firm. And one of the reasons for that is that in a law school environment, there are a number of structures in place. There's a class schedule. There is a clear set of expectations in terms of how you will be evaluated. There are course requirements in order to graduate from law school. So things are set up in a fairly predictable way versus a law firm environment where there may be much less structure. It may be less clear to the lawyer what the expectations are. Your work is more fluid. It really depends on what's coming in the door, what projects are available, which lawyers have capacity to work with you, which clients are sending you work. And so it looks very different, and that shift in structure can be really unsettling. And so what you'll want to do is find a way to create structures within your practice that support you and that work for you. So you may think that going from an environment that is highly structured to one that is not structured at all is really liberating and it's really freeing. And yes, there is a lot to be enjoyed about freedom and liberation. But I also invite you to consider that with a lack of structure can sometimes come unclear expectations. It may be unclear how you allocate your resources. You may feel like you have too many choices. And so you'll need to find a way to strategize, to structure, and to plan. And again, I refer you back to last week's episode because I think you'll find there are some helpful tools and strategies there to get you organized and structured. And I also have a number of podcast episodes where I talk about time management. So I'd invite you to scroll through the titles and see what you find, because that might also really help you out. So that is step one, is to look at the scaffolding. Procrastination doesn't happen in a vacuum. How have you set yourself up? The second strategy is to focus squarely on task initiation. So task initiation is an executive functioning skill that is defined as the ability to begin projects without undue procrastination in an efficient or timely fashion. Now, I took this definition from the book I referenced last time, The Smart But Scattered Guide to Success: How to Use Your Brain's Executive Skills to Keep Up, Stay Calm, and Get Organized at Work and at Home. The authors are Peg Dawson and Richard Gere. It's a wonderful book. I highly recommend it. And that is the definition that they offer for task initiation. They also offer a number of strategies that you can consider. And in today's episode, I'm going to talk about a number of strategies that I recommend to clients when they come to me with challenges related to procrastination. So we talked about scaffolding. So now you might imagine yourself sitting down to do a task that you don't particularly want to do. It may be a brief that you're writing. It may be a contract that you're drafting. It may be invoices that you're reviewing. It may be something that you're procrastinating on because it's not urgent, but it's important. So I feel like that about my taxes. I get them done on time, but it's one of those tasks where it's not urgent until it's urgent, and I don't like to leave it until it's urgent for the reasons we talked about a few minutes ago. But in order to make that task a priority, I have to be really intentional about getting it on my calendar. So think about the tasks in your life that are important but not urgent. Maybe it's career planning. Maybe it's meetings with individuals, conversations, whatever it happens to be. But I invite you here to think about where you typically procrastinate, because that's going to help you apply what we're talking about to you and how it will be helpful in your practice. So if you're sitting down to that task and it just feels overwhelming, what I recommend doing, first of all, is to break it down into smaller pieces and to write down each of those pieces. You want to write things down because it takes it out of your working memory and it puts it on a piece of paper where you can see it. When you can see it, it makes it much less overwhelming. Now, all of a sudden, that amorphous task is there on a piece of paper and you can look at the bullet points that you need to execute on. You may be able to rank them in terms of priority. You might see right away that some of them are more time sensitive than others. You might see right away that you're going to need to involve your assistant. You're going to need to involve the client. You need to reach out to another lawyer to help you with something. And so having that down on paper and being able to see exactly what the steps are not only gives you a chance to prioritize and organize, it also makes that task less daunting. And that really helps out when it comes to the next stage, which is using a method to initiate. And there are two that I love. One of them is the salami method. The other is the Pomodoro method. Yes, they are both food related. They remind me of pizza. So you can think of the pizza, and the salami method is really the idea that you take that task and you slice it up like a salami, and then you tackle one slice at a time. The Pomodoro method is rooted from the Italian word tomato, or pomodoro. You know what I'm trying to say here. And I gather in Italy, there are these things called tomato timers. And so you can set a timer, maybe it's for 25 minutes, and you give yourself that time to just simply work on the task. So if you've got your list of what that task involves in front of you, you just start anywhere and you just work for 25 minutes. You tell yourself, I just have to do this for 25 minutes. If 25 minutes seems too long, make it shorter. Make it 5 minutes. The goal here is just to initiate. And what you'll very likely find is that once you are initiated, the work will flow a lot more smoothly. So these are two really great ways to initiate the task initiation. Another thing you can do is talk to yourself. Now, I love this strategy mostly because it is validating to me. I like to talk to myself. I don't typically have very long conversations with myself, but sometimes, especially because I work alone at home a lot of the time, I kind of need to give myself a little chit chat now and again. Total aside, but on the days where I don't talk to anybody, I really pity the first grown-up that I see because I tend to chat quite a bit. I don't know if that happens to you. If you've had a solid day of work, most of it solo, you can really find it exciting. When you go to buy that loaf of bread, all of a sudden you really want to have a conversation about it. Anyhow, what I'm trying to say here is that talking to yourself is a legitimate strategy when it comes to task initiation. And it's important that you choose the words that you say to yourself carefully. So you might want to ask yourself a question like, what is one thing I can do? Or what is the next item on my list? Or what's the easiest thing that I can do? Or what's the hardest thing I can do? You may find that you need to give yourself a little pep talk. If the task is really daunting, you might need to be telling yourself, you know what? I've done this before. I can do it again. This is exactly the kind of work that I was made to do. I mean, think of what your go-to pep talk might sound like, and you can do that next time you find yourself procrastinating on a task. A couple more strategies here for initiation is to talk to somebody else. Commit to somebody else that you're going to get started on a project. Sometimes we are more likely to follow through when we promise to somebody else that we will do something relative to when we say it to ourselves. So do that, whether it's your assistant, whether it's a friend, a colleague, doesn't matter. You just want to declare that you're going to do it, and that will help you overcome the inertia of not doing it. And then finally, you might enlist a body double. And body doubling is a concept that I learned about in my research and my training that I'm getting in relation to ADHD coaching. And what I've learned is that it's sometimes really helpful to have a body double to work alongside you, to stay motivated, to initiate the work that you don't necessarily want to do. So you may have done this in law school. You may have had study buddies. I had them, somebody that maybe just sat with you at the library to be there to study alongside you. You may find that it helps to go into the office. If you've got the option of working remotely or working at the office, you may find that it is helpful to be surrounded by other humans. You may also find that you have a way of virtual body doubling. It could be that you get on a Zoom call with somebody. I personally find Zoom a little bit too overwhelming or exhausting if I'm on it for too long, so that doesn't work for me. But when I really have an awful task, I might send a text message to somebody to say, going back to that earlier example, to say I'm going to do it. So there's different ways of using this body doubling concept to help you overcome that inertia or to help you stay on task when it's something that you really don't want to do. So that's task or strategy number 2 is to focus on task initiation. And the third strategy here is to focus on emotional regulation. Now, it may be surprising to you to draw a connection between your emotions and procrastination, but a lot of procrastination is rooted in how we feel. And so what we talk about in this
particular strategy will be really helpful if you find that your emotions are keeping you from initiating a particular task. So the definition for emotional regulation, again, comes from the book Smart But Scattered. They talk about it as emotional control. I prefer the term emotional regulation. And they describe it as the ability to manage emotions to achieve goals, complete tasks, or control and direct behavior. And if you're interested in emotional regulation, I did a podcast episode not that long ago with Bina Stock. Bina Stock is an incredible lawyer turned counselor for lawyers. It's episode 78. We talk about emotional regulation, and she offers some really helpful tools. In that episode, we talked more about those situations where you find yourself on the verge of losing your cool. I think that's how we often think about emotional regulation. It's like anger management or stress management. And here we're really dealing with the emotional components. The same exercise, it's just a different emotion. So we're not trying to manage our anger necessarily. We're trying to manage that emotion of dread or fear perhaps, or anxiety. Or boredom. So I invite you to listen to that episode if you want a more in-depth exploration of emotional regulation. And for the purposes of today, what I would invite you to think about is what emotions you experience when you are procrastinating. So if you think about yourself, maybe it's something that you recently procrastinated on, maybe it's something that you anticipate in the future, maybe you want to just notice, you might pay attention to what emotions you're feeling. Chances are you're feeling boredom. Sometimes the task feels boring, and so that's the reason why you want to put it off. Sometimes the task feels overwhelming and there's fear associated with it. You may be a perfectionist and you are fearful of the work product not being perfect. And so instead of getting started and dealing with an imperfect product, you don't get started at all, which of course is a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you don't get started and you push back the timeline and you start late and you don't have time to really do a good job, you're not going to be delivering that product at the level that you want to. So that might be an emotion that you're feeling when you're procrastinating. You might feel dread. It may be that you're anticipating backlash. You're anticipating that somebody's not going to like the answer that you're about to give them. You might be anticipating judgment from somebody else. And so these are all emotions that you may feel when you are procrastinating. And what I recommend doing there is to develop strategies to deal with the emotions. When you can deal with those emotions, it will help you to deal with the procrastination. So it helps when you're dealing with emotions to be able to label them, identify them. So next time you find yourself procrastinating, figure out what that emotion is and give it a label, whether it's boredom, whether it's dread, whether it's fear. Then I'm going to invite you to just allow yourself to feel the feeling. And if you're anything like me, you may have distanced yourself from your emotional life at some stage in your legal career. I did it in law school. I remember just deciding one day that the emotional part of my life just wasn't relevant anymore. It certainly wasn't relevant to legal analysis, and it was kind of just holding me back. So I really stepped away from what I was feeling and I ignored it for a very long time. And it's only in the last few years since becoming a coach and really doing a deep dive into why emotions matter, how they can be helpful, how they actually convey useful information. It's only recently that I've really started exploring how to tune into my emotions, how to understand them, how to use them better. And I'd invite you to do the same. So if we look at the example of boredom, for example, you may sit down to a task and you find it boring and you procrastinate. And what I would invite you to do here is to look at that in context. If you procrastinate once in a blue moon because something is boring, it's probably not a problem. But if you find yourself procrastinating on tasks from the moment you arrive in the office to the moment that you leave, because of boredom, it may be that there's something bigger going on. You may be truly bored with your work, in which case it might be a signal to you that there's something else that needs to be resolved. And what's interesting from my perspective as a coach is that two of the areas where I receive the most questions are in the areas of practice management and job transitions. And what I find is that sometimes there's a correlation between the job transition and the practice management, that the reason the practice isn't being managed the way that the lawyer wants it to is because they're bored and they're frustrated and they don't want to do the work. And so there's so much resistance. And so if you're able to solve the bigger problem, which is the career question, right? Are you on the right track? Are you doing work that you enjoy? Are you feeling motivated day to day? Do you see that there's a long-term objective for you? The procrastination problem can go away. So I would really invite you to look at what those emotions are and ask yourself if they're trying to tell you something that may involve the bigger picture, more than just the task at hand. Now, going back to the task at hand, because if you need to file the document, you may not have time to go into all of the questions that might come up in a job transition situation. You just need a strategy that you can apply really, really fast. So what I encourage you to do there is to look at the relationship between your thoughts, your feelings, and your actions. This relationship is explored in the concept of cognitive behavioral therapy. I believe it's Aaron Beck who initially coined the term and the concept. And what you'll find is that there is a relationship between how you think, how you feel, and how you act. So again, if you are about to write an argument for court, and if you look at it and you are dreading it because you're anticipating maybe your case is weak and you know it, and you are grasping at straws and you feel like the responsibility is on your shoulders. Your client is desperate. They're really wanting you to come through for them, to work a miracle, whatever it is. And so you're feeling this sense of dread and you're thinking, I'm never going to get this right. There's no way we're going to win. This is really awful. They're wasting their money. If those are the thoughts that are going through your mind and you then see what emotions come from that, it likely is dread. Maybe it's anxiety. It's some combination. And the result of that is that you don't feel motivated. And so you put it off. You don't want to do it. You don't want to write the brief. Now, if you were able to reframe that situation, you may find that you're able to think differently, right? Maybe it's, I've told the client the risk. They know this is unlikely to win, but I'm going to give it my best shot. If anybody can do it, I can. Maybe there's a creative way for me to craft a winning argument. If you start giving yourself a more positive narrative, that might lead to a different feeling. Maybe it's hopeful or optimistic or determined. And from that place, the action that you'll take will be different. It may not be procrastination. It might be just getting started. And so I'd invite you to think about the thoughts you're having, the feelings you're having, the actions you're taking, how those all relate to each other, and to be intentional. If you notice yourself going to boredom, what else could you possibly be feeling or thinking in relation to the work that you're doing? And can you intentionally reframe the situation in a way that is more conducive to you wanting to act? Another way to look at this is to say, if I were to act on this, what is it that I need to do? What is the action I need to take? How do I want to feel? So you might choose that feeling, and then you might work your way backwards. What do I need to think? What do I need to believe in order to feel that way? So there's a lot of leverage here. And so when you start finding yourself procrastinating, and then you take it back a step and you look at your task initiation skills, are you doing some of the strategies that I mentioned earlier? And are you looking at the emotional component of it? Are you aware of the fact that you are feeling dread? And does this help you by looking at the emotions, the thoughts, the feelings, and reframing in order to overcome the emotional barrier that stands between you and initiating action? So those are the three strategies that I've offered here. Number one, scaffolding. Number two, deep dive into task initiation and using some of the strategies that I recommended today. And of course, number three, which is to deal with the emotional regulation component of it. Now, the reason that these strategies will work is that you're being very targeted. You're looking at the specific executive functions, task initiation, and emotional regulation. You're not trying to wage a battle using a scattergun approach against a vague problem. You have a specific problem that you can tackle with precision. You will gain awareness. When you really focus in on procrastination and what's going on, you'll become more aware of when it's likely to happen. You'll see what you're telling yourself when you procrastinate, and you may notice a pattern there. You'll learn what works for you as a strategy to overcome procrastination. You'll be able to distance yourself from any shame that you might feel about procrastination. You'll figure out what works for you and what doesn't, and you'll be able to pair your strengths with your weaknesses. So as we go through this 4-part series, you'll learn about different executive functions. You'll find that you're really strong in some of them and maybe not as strong in others, and you can use them to work with each other. So if last week you thought, I'm really strong in planning and organization, but I'm less strong in task initiation, you can build up your scaffolding to further support your task initiation. Now, you'll need to exercise a few skills here. Number 1, I highly recommend going into this exercise with a growth mindset. I've talked about growth mindset on the podcast before. This is a concept that was coined by Carol Dweck, an American psychologist. And at the heart of it is the idea that if something is challenging to you, it's not a sign that there is something wrong with you. It's actually an opportunity for you to learn and to grow. And it's all rooted in the concept that your brain will actually get stronger and better. Your skills will get stronger and better as you exercise them, as you develop them. And that's all consistent with the latest research on neuroplasticity. So that's number 1. You'll need to have a growth mindset. You have to go in there with the idea that, yes, you can build these skills. Yes, there is the promise of hope. Another skill you'll need is the willingness to try. You're going to have to be willing to continue to apply effort because it is consistent effort that is going to achieve the result. You'll need to apply strategic thinking. You're going to have to train yourself to look at practice management, to look at procrastination through the lens of executive function and be able to pull on the lever that you need to pull on most. You're also going to need to be curious about what it is that is creating a problem for you. That's getting curious about the emotional response that you're having, is getting curious about where you struggle with procrastination. What you will create as a result is you'll see improvement. And as you start to see improvement, you'll get attached to the result. And if you've ever found that you've started to succeed and that leads to more success, that's exactly what can happen here. You may even become excited. Now, this is next level. This is maybe not everybody, but you might grow to the point where you actually get excited when you procrastinate because it becomes an opportunity for you to learn and develop your skills to then overcome that procrastination. You may also increasingly identify yourself as a person who gets things done. So instead of being a procrastinator, you might see yourself as somebody who is efficient, who is proactive, and maybe who sometimes procrastinates, but you'll no longer carry that label around with you. So that, my friends, is what I have for you this week. I'm so glad you tuned in. I hope this episode has been really helpful for you. If procrastination is something that you struggle with, I've got a number of podcast episodes that I've recorded on the topic, and we will link to those in the show notes. The show notes, of course, are on the webpage that hosts this podcast episode on the joyfulpractice.com website, so you can check those out. If you like this topic, I would love to hear from you. Please feel free to send me an email, send me a message on LinkedIn, submit a form through the website. I just love hearing from you. I would also love if you would leave a rating and review wherever it is that you download your podcast episodes. That would be so helpful in terms of helping other people find this podcast. And with that, I'm going to wrap up. So as I mentioned last week, we talked about planning and organization. This week, of course, was procrastination. Join me next week. We're going to be talking about staying on task. And so please join me for that. And that's staying focused, dealing with distractions like email or snacks. I know that nothing whets my appetite like a stack of documents to review, right? The minute you see it, it's like you just want to run off to the snack room. So think about what distractions come up for you. And next week, we're going to be talking about how to handle those. So please join me next week. I will absolutely love to reconnect with you. I hope you have enjoyed today's episode as much as I have enjoyed recording it for you. And have a wonderful week. Take care, my friend. Bye for now.
If you enjoyed today's show and don't want to miss an episode, subscribe and follow the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you haven't already, please leave a rating and review. Your feedback will help me create a podcast that's tailored to your needs and goes straight to the heart of what matters to you. For instructions on how to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com/podcast launch. See you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. If you want more information, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com. See you next week.